everyone, and welcome to another episode of At War, the podcast of the Conflict Law Center. Today, we're going to be talking about drone strikes, and we have with us Dr. Ahmad Siddiqui. Dr. Ahmad Siddiqui is a novelist and an academic. He completed his PhD from Oxford on the topic of Pakistan's relationship with Afghanistan and the impact of the Soviet occupation. He has taught courses on revolutionary war and counterinsurgency, the history and politics of Afghanistan, and the Israel-Palestine conflict at LUMS and the Lahore School of Economics. He is presently also writing a trilogy of fantasy novels based loosely off the culture and history of the medieval Islamicate. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Glad to be here.
So this actually arose because I read your paper from 2015 on drone strikes. It was so interesting, and I think we're going to get into that in a lot more detail in the discussion. And we'll also put the link in the bio for anyone who wants to go back and read it. I suggest to everyone that they do. But just starting off and like getting the ball rolling, I wanted to ask a really, really general question before we go into the nitty-gritty of who is targeted and how and all of that kind of stuff. In that, do you think that the advent of drone strikes, their operation globally from Pakistan to Yemen, doesn't it infringe a basic right that humanity has had since the Magna Carta, the right to a fair trial?
Yeah, I mean, in a sense, yes. It's interesting you bring that up because the notion of drone strikes also came in response, and at least the escalation to the extent, to the level that it was during the Obama presidency, was in large part a response to the situation created by Guantanamo. Where people, I think 779 prisoners were sent up till now. More than 600 have released gradually over the succeeding 2 decades, mostly without trials. And Guantanamo became a big cause at that time. Even Obama, when he was running for his presidency, also promised to shut it down, a promise which was never kept. So although drone strikes did start earlier during the Bush administration, they escalated a lot during the Obama administration. And there was almost a shift of the administration from a policy of capturing people without free trial to killing people without free trial. Now, the administration would argue that, this is a war zone and therefore, concepts like free trial don't exist when you're engaged in active war against enemy combatants. But the fact of being able to use drone strikes rather than commit U.S. troops and rather than commit either on the ground or in the air has also allowed the administration to use drone strikes as a means of carrying out war in undeclared war zones. So none of those wars were actually, in many places where it's been used, in Pakistan, Yemen, Somalia, the U.S. is not actually actively does not actually have a declared war in place. And so the use of drones has been a means for the administration to kind of have the best of both worlds, in a sense. They don't have to deal with the issue of trial and if thinking of things as a policing or justice matter, but they also don't have to submit themselves to the oversights that Congress has in terms of declaring war, in terms of oversight committees and the like.
Yeah, and also the issue of detention, right? Because then you don't need to deal with them. You don't
need to deal with what the outcome of that is.
Yeah, exactly. And it's quite interesting to look at it in terms of the way drone strikes have come about. So, and you mentioned this actually at the beginning of your paper, which is that this is what the supporters say, this is what the detractors say. And the supporters, and we even have Pakistanis who, have kind of hinged on the side of being like, oh, maybe drone strikes are a good thing. And they kind of argue that you're seeing less collateral damage with drone strikes because they're incredibly precise. They actually comply far more with the laws of war than aerial strikes, aerial bombardments that we've seen in the past. And especially, it kind of blew my mind to see the Hellfire 2 missile and the fact that it can go through a building and detonate 2-3 floors down from the point of impact. So then it blows up there, which is incredibly targeted. And it's the likes of stuff that we've never seen before. So we have civilian casualties being reduced, but they also allow for the proliferation of the use of drones because now countries like the US will be like, actually, we need more drones, less boots on the ground, like you say. And we're complying more with the laws of war. So what's the problem? And, it's detractors being like, actually, what ends up happening is that you have an ever expanding entitlement to use force, which do you believe that actually, you proliferate their use, you proliferate the areas in which they're used, because then you don't need to have them used in a war zone even. You can have them used wherever you're just sat there in Langley, Virginia, kind of like using a joystick, and you can use them wherever. And also, that they're very counterproductive in that they actually increase the risk of counterinsurgency. So like I think both of us kind of come down quite hard on the side that they shouldn't be allowed. But just in terms of your thoughts about weighing these two arguments.
So I think for the first part, absolutely, I think it does lower the barriers to conflict. And that's just not just my and your conclusion. That's the conclusion of a number of studies and think tanks within the US military intelligence apparatus as well. So, for example, the Stimson Center task force on drone strikes, which was primarily staffed by retired military intelligence officials in the US, raised this very concern that in the absence of public debate, in the absence of risk to US soldiers and personnel, the ability to use drones outside of declared war zones was substantially reducing the barriers to conflict and making it easier to engage in conflict, where the supporters often argue, look, the alternative is these less discriminate sort of bombardments or sending in troops and causing more casualties. But in many cases where drones are used, the alternative is not those kinds of methods or drones. They usually often the alternative is drones or no drones,
right?
Because that's how the calculus plays out. There's one in particular within the U.S. Military. Again, there were comments about the notion that the U.S. was actually carrying out strikes within a nuclear-armed country without a boot in the ground. That was seen as something revolutionary from that perspective. So in a sense, yes, I think the use of drones in this way certainly makes it more likely to cause conflict in places where there isn't otherwise. But I do also feel that the notion that drones are more precise and cause less civilian casualties is not very well established.
Okay.
So partly the issue is that a lot of critics kind of confuse precision of a specific weapons platform with all of the inputs that go into the process by which decisions to carry out an attack are made.
Yes.
And so the precision of drones as a weapon is, in terms of their ability to take civilian lives or not take civilian lives, is dependent a lot on the sort of intelligence that is feeding into those decisions. There's two types of intelligence that U.S. military planners talk about. There's human intelligence and signals intelligence. Humans intelligence is basically tip-offs, informers on the ground, and that kind of thing. Signals intelligence relates to surveillance by drones, relates to things like cell phone tracking technologies and the like. And often in the kind of conflicts in which drones are deployed, both those sources of intelligence are relatively poor. So the US does not have extensive networks of informers within FATA. There are also issues when it was using drone strikes there. There were also issues about the incentives that were being provided to people in order to report on supposed militants in those areas. It's a dynamic that was seen in Afghanistan, where U.S. commanders again noted that a lot of intelligence tip-offs were primarily based on local rivalries, or there was a range of incentives that affect the quality of that intelligence that comes in, and so therefore that affects the likelihood of civilians being killed. Secondly, I also think that in fact in Afghanistan, there's a particular study which is mostly classified as based on U.S. intelligence data, and it's from the Joint Special Operations Command. But the conclusions are available, and according to the conclusions, which talked about drone strikes in Afghanistan. Drone strikes in Afghanistan were seen to have close to the same number of civilian casualties per incident as manned aircraft, and were an order of magnitude more likely to result in civilian casualties per engagement.
Wow.
So the idea is that when they define an incident, they mean any situation like an event in which civilians were killed. So when civilians were killed, whether it was a drone strike or by an airstrike, on average, the same number of civilians were killed. But drones were 10 times more likely to actually cause civilian casualties, and that again comes back to the kind of situations in which they're used, situations in which you would not risk your pilots because you don't know enough of what's going on. But you can send in a drone because there's very little cost involved in that.
Yeah, and I think the thing that annoys me the most about drone strikes is the amount of talk there is about the drone operators and what they go through, and the fact that they might have this special form of PTSD because they're following their targets so closely. They see them playing with their children and that kind of thing. And I remember reading a book called Drone Warfare by a French author, which was like they did more research into this, and they were like, it is nothing compared to how you would be in combat. Like this is a kind of an almost invented American thing of it being like, this is how you would feel if like your Sims character died. It's nothing really more than that. Even if they see, and I was reading quite recently about how a target was taken out and his child was left behind. And then the drone operator had to see the child go and pick up parts of his father's body and put them together. And that he was traumatized by that. And it's the whole idea of, it's just a very Hollywoodized kind of Americanized version of everything where like the focus is always on them and always what they're going through. And I kind of wanted to talk to you about the definition of militancy, because you talk about it a lot in the paper in terms of this different approach, and you quote someone saying that their definition of militant is really just young men with stubble. So it's literally just military aged men, and that Obama came in and then he was like, all of you count as combatants unless posthumously you're proved to be innocent. And it was like a very strange, like, you're innocent until you're guilty unless you're proven innocent, that too after your death. So can you talk to me a bit more about what we're talking about when we're talking about signature strikes, or what we're talking about when we're talking about personality strikes, and how they really blur the distinction between people who are or who aren't directly participating in hostilities? Because even going to high ground and getting cell phone signal, that could count as, questionable behavior. It could put you on a kill list, even if you're going up there trying to find signal. Digging anything means that you are potentially planting an IED. Again, you could potentially be on a kill list because of that. So what does America mean when they're talking about these personality strikes and signature strikes?
So the distinction between personality strikes and signature strikes. So from about June 2004, speaking of Pakistan, that's when the first drone strike was carried out here that we know of. From June 2004 till December 2007, the strikes were called personality strikes. So that the idea was that they were targeted against specific what we call high value targets, deemed to be leaders of Al Qaeda or the Taliban. And who were considered part of the senior leadership by whatever metric was used. And so drone strikes were only carried out during that period under the Bush administration when there was specific intelligence related to an identified high-value target, and if a drone strike would be called out in response to that. Now, this intelligence was still very often wrong. So there are very high civilian casualties in drone strikes carried out during this period in the Bush administration. I mean, the most notable single incident was the attack on the madrasa in Bajor in 2006, which killed 82 people, 70 of whom were children. So there were a lot of civilian casualties in those drone strikes, but the fact that they were only carried out in response to specific tip-offs meant that the total number of drone strikes during that 3-year period remained low. So there's, again, this is not in Pakistan, this was not a program that was ever officially acknowledged or any documentation provided. So the numbers of strikes are based off of news reports, are based off of accounts that certain aggregators have collected. But the range is believed to be about 10 to 14 strikes during that period till 2007. In start of 2008 onwards, the Bush administration started using signature strikes. Now, these signature strikes are basically against people whose identities are not necessarily known, but who have certain signatures which are believed to be indicative of either being engaged in militant activity or being associated with a militant organization. And what precisely these signatures, or the other term that's used is patterns of life analysis, the idea of what kind of activities they're doing. What precisely they are is not, has not been spelled out. But it's notable when U.S. officials were confronted with the consequences of strikes that they had carried out, that they would fall back on certain responses.
Okay.
So, for example, there was a strike in Dattakhil in March of 2011, which killed about 42 people at a local jirga, most of whom were pro-government elders, people of the Khasadar, Frontier Corps. There were also believed to be maybe about 4 Taliban members who were basically adjudicating a local dispute over chromium mine. But this was a jirga that had 10 days in advance been provided authorization by the local authorities and so on. So when the US spokespeople were provided with information about the actual identities of all of the people who were killed in this jirga, the response was, look, you may have whatever intelligence you have, but we know that a group of heavily armed men were involved in this, and many of them were carrying out behavior consistent with militants, or consistent with Al-Qaeda militants. So this notion of heavily armed men, again, when you're talking about Fatah, the former Fatah, having a gun on you is very commonplace. It's part of it's part of the local culture. It's considered part of an individual's honor. In general, insurgents don't have specific uniforms. They don't dress differently. They don't look different from other groups. And so the idea is that these drones were sort of trying to analyze, and drone operators were trying to analyze, and on the basis of very little intelligence, very little specific intelligence, what kinds of people. So if you notice a lot of heavily armed people in a pickup truck moving somewhere, that's seen as a potential threat. And once you expand your strikes to this kind of to a situation where you no longer even know the identities of the people that you're targeting, then that opens it up to all kinds of consequences like these. None of these deaths, again, are officially in very few cases are these actually officially acknowledged by the U.S. government. So you mentioned the issue, the definition which the Obama administration used to classify civilians, and as you said, the definition was which came out in interviews with the New York Times of administration officials. The definition was all military-age males in a strike zone will be considered enemy combatants, unless there's explicit posthumous evidence declaring them innocent. This sort of implies that there's some sort of process posthumously for determining innocence, but there was no such process at all. There was no indication that the administration was actually carrying out any investigations into who they were killed. And often when these deaths were brought, when identities of civilians who were killed in these attacks were brought to the administration officials, they would be met with these blanket denials as well. So based on that kind of process, during the Obama period, the likes of CIA Director John Brennan were able to claim that in 2012 0 civilians were killed.
Okay,
if that's the method that you're using, then of course you're going to get that kind of answer.
It's quite outrageous that even Nobel Prize winner Obama thought that was like a very great metric for drone strikes. It's interesting to look at them from that perspective, from the legal. We're looking at them in terms of civilian casualties, how accurate they are. And I also want to look at them from the perspective of, some people being like, nonetheless, they are legitimate because they're effective. And there's a really, really interesting bit in your paper where I can't remember who you're quoting right now, but he was talking about the strangely egalitarian nature of the Taliban, in the sense that it's not the kind of central command structure that we kind of picture, where like you cut off the head and then the rest of it kind of falls apart. They're like, actually when they sit in a circle, they're like, everyone here is going to be as good a leader as I can be. And so when they do that, the minute you get rid of a leader, there's another one to take its place. Right. Within 24 hours, you have that nothing ends up being changed. So nothing changes. And so what do you think about that in terms of the counter to, yes, but they're still effective?
Right. So The person you were mentioning, so he was the CIA station chief in Pakistan during the late 1980s.
Okay.
During the Mujahideen insurgency against the Soviet occupation. And as the CIA station chief, he was liaising very directly with Mujahideen commanders, both in terms of financing and logistics and in terms of operations. So working very closely with both the ISI and the Mujahideen commanders. And so he had a lot of experience with these organizations and with their battlefield performance. And his argument was that basically the kind of structures that the tribal structures in that region are sort of egalitarian in the sense that there's lots of very small sub-tribes. There's the kind of organizations that are formed don't have any central command. As a result, and that was also that causes certain problems for an insurgency. So for example, the Mujahideen in Afghanistan were never able to carry out very coordinated large-scale attacks because they were a mostly fragmented insurgency. But what that meant is that taking out an individual leader would at most mean that for a small period that particular front would remain inactive until a new leader established himself.
Okay.
But for the large part, the rest of it would continue being active. And the case is similar with the TTP. The TTP was an umbrella conglomerate of some 40 groups that came together without any sort of central strategy. A lot of these groups are effectively performing autonomously. So the effectiveness of taking out the leadership with that sort of a structure is very, very questionable. And there were studies that looked at, for example, the use of air power in Afghanistan, and the use of specifically drone strikes in Afghanistan as well. So when one review, and this is again coming from a U.S. military source, it was a review of studies on drone strikes for the U.S. Army War College Strategic Studies Institute. Concluded that drone strikes had no effect on insurgent violence in Afghanistan. Now, the main purpose that the US was carrying out drone strikes in Pakistan was to stop groups from being able to carry out activities from crossing the border from Pakistan to Afghanistan. So they concluded that on insurgent violence in Afghanistan, there was no outcome. This was a review of all the studies. One study found a small reduction in insurgent violence in FATA, but the other studies which focused on Pakistan as a whole and not just FATA, again, either saw that there was no effect or that there was an actual increase in violence in response to drone strikes. Another study on air power in Afghanistan found that, in general, the use of airstrikes in Afghanistan was positively correlated with subsequent insurgent violence, suggesting that not only do these strikes not significantly degrade an insurgent organization, but the organization is then able to use that as a reputation building mechanism to show, we can still carry out, look, we're still here, we can still carry out attacks. And so it results in actually more attacks taking place.
And for me, I really do want to talk about Pakistan's role in consenting to drone strikes, because we know that they played a very Janus-headed role, where they're going to say, behind closed doors, they're going to be like, yes, drone strikes are fine. We know that PM Gilani even said, we actually asked for more drone strikes. Like he actually wanted the Americans to do more of it. We know that they had a clearing the airspace kind of policy, as in the US would be like, we're going to conduct drone strikes here. And then you would have the airspace in that area being completely cleared. So kind of implicitly, impliedly consenting to them. And yet a public decrying of drone strikes, a public brouhaha in parliament about how, it's an attack on our sovereignty, we shouldn't allow this, that kind of thing. So what do you think could have been done to protect Pakistan's sovereignty? Like, are we just for me, if I'm talking about a sovereign state and someone is putting a weapon into that state, you shoot the drone down. That's what a sovereign state would do. But am I living in La La Land? Do we have to, sit back and think about power relations and think about what Pakistan could have actually done? And even if we're thinking about it in the sense that we could not have done anything we couldn't have said no to drone strikes at the time, is there more that we could have done in terms of even providing for the victims?
Right. I think it wasn't just Prime Minister Gilani. Before that, President Musharraf, in an interview with CNN, admitted, this was I think in April 2013, that he admitted that there was approval given. He argued that it is only for, during his period, he argued that it was only for a very specific number of strikes where the targets were known, and where there was no risk of civilian casualties. That was his claim in any case. So we do know that there has been a level of cooperation. It doesn't necessarily mean that, and I don't believe it means that they signed off on all of the drone strikes that were taking place. But there was certainly a policy of, if not approving, at least minimizing the fallout and choosing not to make it an issue. And it was certainly something that could have been made an issue, and was at certain time. And in terms of the sort of responses that could have been taken. There was incident in Salalah in November 2011 where 24 Pakistani Army soldiers were killed by a US attack.
Oh, okay.
And the response at that time was to blockade NATO supplies which were going into Afghanistan. And that blockade stayed in effect for 7 months until the US effectively apologized and addressed some of the concerns that were raised. So there are certainly things that could have been done. There was certainly leverage that the Pakistani state did possess, which it chose not to use in the case of drone strikes. Again, in 2013, in advance of the elections that year, in response to a drone strike, and that was carried out in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, which at that point was governed by the PTI. Local activists started blockading NATO supply routes, and although the US didn't officially, publicly acknowledge that, they effectively paused drone strikes for 6 months while this was going on. So there are certainly ways in which pressure could have been exerted, which it wasn't. So those are some of the responses that I think could have been made. And yes, there absolutely could have been a lot more done in order to compensate victims. So for example, I mean, the FATA Secretariat did have compensation mechanisms for people who were victims of, collateral damage of Pakistani military strikes, or of terrorist attacks. So there was a whole process by which communities could apply to the FATA Secretariat, and the degree of compensation may have been quite minimal, but at least there was some sort of a process. An equivalent process didn't really exist for victims of drone strikes because they weren't acknowledged by either government.
I didn't know that.
Similarly, the US has Congress appropriates $3 million, which for civilian victims of US military interventions globally every year, and which is quite a paltry amount considering the amount of war fronts the US is involved in. But in 2020, none of those funds were actually disbursed because the US doesn't really have a policy of making that easy for victims to claim compensation. There's a general process of stonewalling of that. So certainly a lot more could have been done in terms of compensation.
Yeah, and I think even in terms of awareness, like when we're talking about victims of drone strikes, there's so much being said, and yet there wasn't an attempt made to humanize that face, which I think is in our age is so important in terms of playing that information warfare against each other. Even if I knew of a victim, I can't name you a single victim of drone strikes, and yet I've read so much. It's just because there's not been that media attention to it.
I mean, there was a project by the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, which is one of there's several independent organizations which track drone strike casualties, and they all have certain issues in their methodology. They're mostly based off of newspaper reports. And a lot of the accounts that they get depend a lot on the sources that those newspapers are receiving.
Yeah,
the Bureau is one of the better organizations, and
it was so interesting for me to read that you were skeptical even of their numbers, being they're underreporting.
I believe they have a very high standard for reporting civilian casualties, and because they don't have an equivalent number for militants, so the Bureau doesn't have militants doesn't categorize militants on the basis that militants is not a term that actually exists under international law, which is fine. But that has the inadvertent effect that most people who pick up on the Bureau's figures conclude that only this many civilians are killed and the rest were militants. In reality, the numbers that the Bureau has are numbers for which they have some evidence that civilians were killed. Not always very strong evidence, but in many cases strong evidence. And the very larger number of people who were killed is basically people about whom the Bureau doesn't have information one way or another.
Yeah.
So their minimum, they give a range of a minimum and maximum count of civilian deaths. A minimum count, I'm almost certain, is an underestimate on because of the kind of conservative methods that they use in order to categorize civilian deaths. But in general, they have another project called Naming the Dead project. And when I was looking at these figures, at that point there were somewhere between in 2,000 to 3,000 people believed to have been killed by drone strikes in Pakistan. At that time, the Bureau's Naming of the Dead was able to name about 300. I forget which category is which, but 300 and 322 militants and civilians who had been killed as a consequence of the attacks. And so that was a number there were 700 people that they were able to name, and of those 622 they were able to categorize as civilians and militants. Which suggests, out of about 3,000 people, about maybe 1 in 4 people is even being assigned a name. So how much can you really say about, what people who were killed, whether they were mostly civilians or mostly militants? It's impossible to say.
Yeah, definitely. And I kind of want to end, so my last question is kind of looking at this from like a very forward-looking approach in terms of, we know that now we have US President Biden, and he announced in July 2021 that he's adopting an over-the-horizon counterterrorism approach, which was kind of what he'd also said about Afghanistan a couple of years ago, pre-withdrawal, which is that we're going to have a continued reliance on drones to respond to terrorism without needing to have any American boots on the ground. So again, always saving American casualties. And so in light of the withdrawal of US forces from Afghanistan, what do you think that means for Pakistan going forward? Are we likely to see more drone strikes in Pakistan, or are we going to see a shift in focus away from AFPAC, from this being, a failed war zone, kind of another Vietnam Part 2?
So I don't think in the short term there's going to be much of an increase in drone strikes here. In general, drone strikes declined after about 2014 in Pakistan. They went up on other war fronts. So in Yemen, Somalia, they went up for a few years. But in general, in the last couple of years, I think the numbers are down even on those fronts as well. President Biden, in general, has been a supporter of drones. So even in Afghanistan, during the period when President Obama was trying to decide on a troop surge, Biden was very skeptical of the troop surge, quite correctly. He didn't really believe what the generals were saying in terms of that making a difference to the war in Afghanistan. But his solution to that was drawing down, but with an increased focus on counterterrorism, which meant carrying out drone strikes, carrying special forces raids, that kind of thing. So that has been something that he has been in favor of. Right now, when he came to office, drone strikes were sort of paused as part of a general review. In almost every area, he announced a general review of policies, and so they had been with that. They had been paused as part of that. But I don't see that there's much in his background to suggest that he's become a huge skeptic of the use of drones right now. Within Pakistan, I don't see that being, as you said, because of the withdrawal of troops from Afghanistan, that strategic interest is no longer there. Within Afghanistan, however, there is still, of course, a U.S. global interest in targeting Islamic State operatives, and so within Afghanistan, there's particularly a concern with IS over there.
And even there, when the Americans did the drone strike very, very soon after withdrawal, the Taliban kind of said, this is an attack on our sovereignty, but they didn't really make that much of a fuss and cry.
Well, so that was, one of the very rare cases where the US actually acknowledged civilian deaths of a drone strike, and that was just because there was so much publicity on that at the same time, and people were able to carry out on the ground interviews and revealed it was effectively a signature strike. So they so in terms of what we were talking about earlier, they targeted a white Toyota, which was because
Right.
they had intelligence suggesting that there might be a white Toyota that is carrying attackers, or that the attackers that had carried out the previous bombing had used that sort of vehicle. They didn't know who they're killing. They ended up killing a translator who had worked with U.S. forces, as well as family, and his entire family, 7 children, were killed in that. And that was very soon after this decision of maintaining an over-the-horizon capability. So I don't know if that has had any impact on that decision, but in general, the U.S. has an interest in working with the Taliban against ISIS, and has been in the last few years been under the table again, working with them to attack ISIS. But the U.S. has also made no breakthroughs in its relations with the Taliban. It is still subjecting Afghanistan to heavy sanctions, and by withdrawal of aid has played a role in the economic crisis that is currently happening there. So unless that situation gets resolved, there's less and less interest for the Taliban in terms of cooperating with the U.S. against ISIS. They still have their own individual interest in fighting ISIS. They are enemies within Afghanistan. But again, a lot does what happens in Afghanistan over the succeeding months or years may well affect the extent to which we might say drone strikes coming back there. If there's a general collapse of the Afghan state, or if ISIS takes on further root there, you may begin to see drone strikes being revived there again. So specific war fronts again will depend on strategic interests, but I haven't really seen any indication or acceptance from the U.S. administration about the limitations of drone strikes as a whole. As I said, that within the military, there are often studies or accounts that question their effectiveness within a broader counterinsurgency strategy. But they still remain very popular at levels of the administration, at levels of the military intelligence complex, where without genuine recognition and assessment of their failings and limitations, I believe that that interest in maintaining that over the horizon capability, as he calls it, will remain, and that may lead to flare-ups in different hotspots depending on how the political situations there develop.
Right. Yeah. Very interesting. Thank you so much for joining us today. I think that was a really, really interesting discussion. I hope everyone enjoyed that at home, and I hope that you tune in for future episodes. Thank you.